In songwriting, we're always worrying about chord choices, how to write a catchy melody, what lyrical structures or rhyme schemes are going to best serve our narrative. But we never really talk about one crucial element that can absolutely be the difference between your song losing the interest of a listener and that very same song captivating an audience and taking them on a journey throughout the entire song form. In this video, we're going to talk about how to make your songs more interesting, how to create more contrast, how to generate more movement and engagement and delight for your listener, all by focusing on the power of dynamics. Now, when we talk about dynamics, we're talking about volume, and we're really thinking about the difference between the loudest elements in your composition and the softest elements in your composition. The difference between the loudest and the softest elements is called dynamic range. And if we look at the waveform for the Black Sabbath classic Paranoid, we can see there's a little movement up and down, but not a huge dynamic range. And rock tracks are often played loud all the way through and are heavily compressed, so it's not a surprise to see a small dynamic range. By comparison, if we look at the waveform for Beethoven's Fifth, we see a huge amount of dynamic range. And this is also fairly typical of classical music. Now, some of you might be thinking dynamics and volume, that's a mixing issue. That's part of the production process. What I'm going to show you in this video is that dynamics is a songwriting tool. It is absolutely part of the songwriting process. And the more we can learn to use dynamics in our songwriting process, the more contrast and movement we can create. Now, if I start strumming the guitar and changing how hard I hit the strings, you'll see the multimeter responding. And you can clearly see and hear what a big difference there is when I'm brushing the strings lightly, as opposed to digging in and really hitting them quite aggressively. But why does that matter? What's at stake if we don't consider dynamics? I was recently at a concert in a large venue, and somewhere in the middle of the set, the artist was halfway through a song and the chords were lovely, the melody was nice, the lyrics sounded interesting, and generally speaking, in terms of pitch and timing, they were performing the song really well. But what suddenly struck me halfway through that song was the realization that I was no longer paying attention. I had tuned out because everything was just being played at the same volume. There was no up or down. It was all flat. And so everything was blending into each other and my ears simply disconnected. And as I was sitting there, this gave me such a huge insight that without dynamic range, you risk losing your audience. You risk them tuning out and turning off and disconnecting. Dynamics is absolutely one of those ways we can create motion and movement and interest and contrast for the listener's ear. And something else you sometimes hear is the musician or the songwriter bashing away at their instrument, striking it aggressively and pushing the volume as high as they can go, which is great for some types of songs and certain moments in songs that require a high energy approach. But repeatedly playing your instrument hard without thinking about it can have some serious consequences. It distorts the tone, which again is sometimes desirable but often not appropriate. It affects the tuning of the instrument. It dramatically decreases accuracy, and it usually leads to fatigue or injury for the performer. So one way we can use dynamics is to create contrast between sections, and this is really effective for a number of reasons. Firstly, if dynamics are creating contrast, we don't have to put as much pressure on the other elements of our song. We can have the melody and the chords and the rhythm creating subtle variations, but we don't need them to move around too wildly. In fact, you can use the same 3 or 4 chords all the way through a song without it getting repetitive or boring if you use dynamics well, and I'll demonstrate that in a minute. The other thing dynamics does really well when you use it to create contrast between sections is it guides the listener through the song form. It helps show them which sections are performing which functions. And we commonly hear this when songs go to the chorus, and we hear that chorus as bigger and louder than the other parts of the song. That reinforces the central idea, the central theme of the song. It spotlights the chorus with that dynamic lift. But of course, we can do the opposite. And because the ear is expecting the chorus to be the loudest part of the song, it's a really great move to actually subvert those expectations and pull the dynamics down in the chorus, like we see with the waveform of Karma Police by Radiohead, where the chorus is in fact the quietest part of the song. Damien Rice also does it beautifully in The Blower's Daughter. And in both of these songs, when the chorus is delivered, not only is it quieter, it's also stripped back in terms of the arrangement. And this makes the lyric feel more intimate. We feel closer to it. We become hyper-focused on the remaining elements and really pay attention to what is being said in that moment. Going back to this idea of playing the same chord progression all the way through, a great example of that is the song Save Tonight by Eagle Eye Cherry. That song plays the same 4 chords all the way through the song form. A minor, F, C, G. Now, because the chords aren't changing, something else has to come along and provide the contrast and create the interest for the ear. And what I might do is just demonstrate how you might play the verse of that song going into the chorus and see how much dynamic range we can create. Now, dynamics is a fundamental part of music, no matter what instrument you're playing. But of course, I'm demonstrating this on guitar, and if you are a songwriter who writes on guitar, you need to know that all of the dynamics comes from your strumming hand or your picking hand. The left hand, in this case, is just changing the chords, and those chords did not change at all throughout that sequence. All of the variation, all of the dynamic range came from this hand changing how hard it was attacking the strings. This is really the engine that drives everything. The hand playing the chords, that's the steering wheel. That's sort of steering us through the chord progression. But all of the power and dynamic variation is coming from this hand. And this became really clear to me one year at the Byron Bay Blues Festival when I saw an American blues band play one of the greatest sets of music I've ever seen. What I really remember about that concert was how the band manipulated the audience and moved us back and forward as one. And they did this by creating huge dynamic variation throughout their songs. I remember at one moment leaning forward, straining to hear what the guitarist was playing in a particular section. And I remember looking across and seeing the rest of the audience doing the same thing. We were all leaning forward as one, straining to hear every little detail. And then the next moment, we were all rocked back on our heels because the band opened up and took it to a whole new level. And that was the moment I realized that you could literally move people back and forward with dynamic range. It is an element of performance and songwriting that has the power to move people physically when they're hearing your music. So we just saw with those chords from Save Tonight how we can easily create a lot of contrast between sections without changing the chords. But let's now zoom in and create some dynamic movement within a section. Let's take those same 4 chords and actually target some of those chords to be louder than all the others. And what we'll do is we'll shift it round so you can hear each of them jump out. So there you could hear me targeting certain chords each time I went round, and this is kind of the language equivalent of accenting certain words. It draws the ear's attention to those moments. And this gives us as the songwriters a tremendous amount of control because it allows us to draw the listener's attention to specific moments when we want them to pay attention to those moments. Now I want to go a step further and take chord movement out of the equation and just focus on a single static chord. Because sometimes we're writing a certain kind of song and we want to stay on that chord for 4, 8, even 16 bars. And in these moments, it's really important that we don't just let the chord sit there and feel too static. And another thing I just want to mention is how important it is to develop a confident relationship with your instrument. Whatever instrument you write on, you really need to get comfortable with the layout of that instrument. And you also need to get your hands to feel comfortable on the instrument. For guitar players, it's really important that we learn how to play different chords in different positions on the neck. And this can actually help us introduce more dynamics into our songwriting because certain inversions allow us to play quieter, more muted chords, and others lend themselves to bigger, more open sounds. To demonstrate, let's just try and create some dynamics between 2 D chord forms. This one here and this one here. Now this one here, is a closed form. It's a bar chord form, and it allows us to create this kind of muted sound, especially if we palm mute with the right hand. This one here has a brighter, more open sound. So I'm just going to move between the two and see how much dynamic range we can create. Now you can imagine if you're writing a song, that could be a really useful technique because it creates a kind of call and response between these two chord voicings, and yet we're just using the same chord. Okay, let's zoom in even further and look at how we can use dynamics when finger picking instead of strumming. So I'm going to play a 3-chord sequence going from D to G over B to C. And I'm going to use the same finger picking pattern for each of those 3 chords, but I'm going to start changing how much pressure I put on different fingers as I'm finger picking. And hopefully you'll see and hear the difference as I change the dynamic focus, but keep the pattern the same. So here's the pattern. Now I was trying to play that fairly flat and fairly even. What I'm going to do now is play the same pattern, but I'm going to focus on the thumb and focus on making the bass notes of each chord louder than the rest. Now I'm going to switch it and emphasize the top notes. The last thing I want to talk about is how important dynamics are in your melody writing and your vocal phrasing. So let's go back to that 3-chord sequence, D major, G over B to C. And we're going to use a little melody with a vocal phrase that goes like this. 3, 4. Nothing looks quite the same anymore, same anymore, same anymore. Nothing looks quite the same anymore, same anymore, same anymore. Now with that melody and that phrase, we've essentially got 3 options we can try. Option number 1 is we make the first part of the phrase the loudest moment, and then we drop down. Nothing looks quite the same anymore, same anymore, same anymore. Nothing looks quite the same anymore, same anymore, same anymore. You can hear that kind of phrasing really gives the whole thing an assertive push, but it also emphasizes the word nothing. Option number 2, we're going to start quiet and then rise towards the middle before falling back down. Nothing looks quite the same anymore, same anymore, same anymore. Nothing looks quite the same anymore, same anymore, same anymore. This has a very different feel to the first option. We're not emphasizing the word nothing. We're now focusing on that phrase, same anymore. And option number 3 is to keep the phrase subdued and lift it towards the back end. Nothing looks quite the same anymore, same anymore, same anymore. Nothing looks quite the same anymore, same anymore, same anymore. Again, it's a different feeling. The phrase is now swelling towards the back end. It's again emphasizing the phrase same anymore, but it's doing it on the repetition. And it leaves us with that word more, feeling quite desperate and emphatic. So when we're putting our melodies and our lyrics together, we want to look at the phrase and consider which words we're trying to spotlight for the listener. Which words are we trying to highlight so that the message of the song is clear and compelling? Happy songwriting.